There's a moment that occurs in almost every forgotten UFO case. A moment that separates what we remember from what we've lost. It's not the sighting itself, not the encounter with the unknown, but what happens in the days and weeks that follow. A witness makes a report. An official investigation begins. Documents are filed. And then, quietly, systematically, the case disappears into administrative silence. The file is labeled, the witnesses are dismissed, and the story fades into the background noise of history. But what if I told you that for every case that vanished into government archives, there was a parallel system working in the shadows? A network of civilian investigators who recognized that something profound was being lost, not through conspiracy or cover-up, but through something far more mundane, institutional indifference. These weren't conspiracy theorists or sensationalists. They were scientists, researchers, and ordinary citizens who understood that when you close a case without truly understanding it, you're not ending an investigation. You're abandoning a question that might matter more than we can imagine. This is the story of the Forgotten Files, the cases that civilian organizations like NICAP, APRO, and CUFOS preserved when official channels moved on. These aren't the famous cases you've heard about. These are the quiet encounters, the unexplained incidents that resisted easy categorization and were set aside precisely because they demanded more attention than institutions were willing to give. What makes these cases extraordinary isn't what they prove, but what they preserve, the authentic texture of human experience confronting the genuinely unknown. To understand why these files matter, we need to understand how cases get forgotten in the first place. It's rarely dramatic. There's no men in black arriving to confiscate evidence, no government agents threatening witnesses into silence. The reality is far more bureaucratic, and in some ways, far more troubling. When a UFO case enters official channels, it enters a system designed to produce conclusions, not preserve questions. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, wasn't created to understand the phenomenon. It was created to manage public concern about it. The mechanics of this process reveal themselves in case after case. A witness reports something extraordinary, an investigator is assigned, interviews are conducted, sometimes thoroughly, sometimes perfunctorily. Then comes the critical moment. The case must be categorized. Explained or unexplained, identified or unknown. The system demands resolution because unresolved cases represent institutional failure. They suggest that the military cannot fully account for objects in American airspace. They imply vulnerability, uncertainty, gaps in knowledge that officials would rather not acknowledge publicly. So the pressure exists, subtle but constant, to find explanations. And when conventional explanations don't quite fit, when the witness testimony doesn't align with the proposed solution, when radar data contradicts the official narrative, the easiest path forward is simplification. Details get omitted from summaries. Witness statements get condensed into single-sentence descriptions. Complex multi-witness events get reduced to administrative footnotes. The case gets closed not because it's been solved, but because it's been processed. This is where civilian investigators recognized an opportunity. Organizations like the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena understood that official summaries were destroying data in the name of efficiency. When you reduce a 2-hour radar visual encounter involving multiple trained observers to a 1-paragraph explanation about weather phenomena, you're not clarifying the record, you're erasing it. And once that erasure happens, future researchers have no way to revisit the case with fresh eyes or new analytical tools. The civilian approach was fundamentally different. Instead of seeking resolution, these organizations sought preservation. They collected original witness statements, maintained correspondence with investigators, documented contradictions and uncertainties, and filed everything without the pressure to conclude. Their archives became a kind of insurance policy against institutional amnesia, ensuring that even when official channels moved on, the raw data of the encounter would survive. What's remarkable about this parallel archival system is how it emerged organically from frustration with official processes. Scientists like J. Allen Hynek, who served as an astronomical consultant to Project Blue Book, watched case after case get explained away with solutions that didn't match the evidence. Pilots reported structured craft performing impossible maneuvers, and the official report would cite Venus or weather balloons. Radar operators logged solid returns that tracked with visual sightings, and the explanation would invoke temperature inversions that couldn't account for the observed behavior. Over time, Hynek and others like him recognized that the problem wasn't a lack of good data. The problem was a system that couldn't afford to acknowledge genuinely unexplained phenomena. Let me take you to a specific moment that illustrates this dynamic perfectly. November 2nd, 1957, Levelland, Texas. A flat stretch of farmland where darkness settles quickly and the nearest city lights are miles away. A driver is heading home when his engine dies. Not sputters, not runs rough, but dies completely. At the same moment, his headlights go out. The radio goes silent. The dashboard goes dark. The car coasts to a stop under its own momentum. The driver sits there in complete darkness, wondering if he's somehow run out of gas or blown a fuse. Then he sees it. A brilliant, elongated light low to the ground, hovering over the roadway ahead. It doesn't move like an aircraft. It doesn't blink. It just hangs there, impossibly bright against the dark Texas sky. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it's gone. And the moment it departs, the engine starts. The lights come back on. The car functions normally again. Now, if this were an isolated incident, it might be easy to dismiss. One witness, one strange experience, one night when a car mysteriously stalled and restarted. But here's what makes the Levelland case extraordinary. Within hours, the police department logged more than a dozen similar reports. Different witnesses, different vehicles, different locations around the town, but the details repeated with unsettling consistency. Engines failing, electrical systems shutting down, a luminous object nearby, normal function returning after the object leaves. Two farmhands driving on a rural road shortly after sunset. Their truck stalls. They exit the vehicle and observe a glowing object resting on the roadway ahead of them. They estimate it to be around 200 feet long, shaped like a torpedo or elongated oval. It emits a bright blue-green light that illuminates the pavement. They're frightened enough to flee the area on foot. When they returned later, the truck starts without issue. Another report comes from a motorist who describes a sudden flash of light crossing the road ahead of him, accompanied by a sensation of heat. His engine dies instantly. He waits several minutes before the vehicle restarts on its own. A college student reports a similar incident near Texas Tech University. He describes a bright object passing overhead, followed by immediate engine failure. He remains in his car until the object disappears. A married couple driving outside Levelland report seeing a luminous shape rising from the roadway and moving silently into the sky. Their car stalls at the same moment. By midnight, the police department has logged multiple calls from people who have never met, describing experiences that share a common thread: mechanical interference coinciding with the presence of an unidentified luminous object. The responding officers don't treat these reports as jokes. Patrolmen are dispatched to check roads and interview witnesses. They record names, times, and locations. They note the similarities even as they struggle to explain them. The incidents are spread over several hours and multiple locations. They're not clustered in a single area. The witnesses don't know one another. Some are locals, others are passing through. What unites them is not belief, but interruption. Each was traveling normally. Each experienced a sudden mechanical failure. Each reported a luminous object. And in nearly every case, the vehicle resumed normal operation shortly afterward. Local explanations are attempted almost immediately. One early theory suggests that a severe electrical storm may have caused temporary engine failures, but weather records show no lightning strikes in the area at the times reported. Witnesses consistently described clear skies. Some mention light cloud cover, but no rain, thunder, or visible storm activity. Another explanation proposes ball lightning, but ball lightning is rare, poorly understood, and doesn't typically appear in clusters across multiple locations while coinciding with mechanical failures, nor does it usually exhibit structured movement or elongated shape. Despite these inconsistencies, the ball lightning explanation is forwarded upward. The United States Air Force is notified. An officer from nearby Reese Air Force Base is assigned to review the case. After a brief inquiry, an official explanation is issued. The sightings are attributed to electrical storms and atmospheric phenomena. The case is considered resolved on paper. But the paperwork tells a different story. The Air Force summary is brief. It omits several witness statements. It doesn't address the synchronized engine failures. It doesn't reconcile the geographic spread of reports. It doesn't explain how atmospheric conditions could repeatedly affect internal combustion engines while leaving vehicles undamaged afterward. For the witnesses, the explanation feels incomplete. For civilian investigators, it feels premature. This is where organizations like NICAP stepped in. They didn't dismiss the Levelland case. They didn't label it extraterrestrial. They didn't claim proof. Instead, they preserved the reports. NICAP investigators compared timelines. They mapped locations. They noted the consistency of descriptions across witnesses who had no contact with one another. They highlighted the mechanical interference, an element present in multiple credible UFO cases across different decades. They also noted what was absent. No witness reports hearing engines or propellers. No one describes blinking navigation lights. No debris is found. No lasting damage is reported. The vehicles involved continue operating normally after the incidents, some for years afterward. NICAP classified the Levelland Lights as unexplained, not mysterious, not solved, simply unresolved. And then, like many civilian preserved cases, it faded from public attention. New sightings took its place. New controversies arose. The late 1950s gave way to the 1960s, and the cultural conversation around UFOs shifted. Levelland became a footnote, a line in a report, a brief mention in books that few read cover to cover. But the file remained. Inside NICAP's archives, the Levelland case is intact. Witness statements are preserved in full. Police logs remain legible. Investigative correspondence survives. It's not celebrated, it's not promoted, it's simply kept. That's what makes it a forgotten file, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked resolution. The next pattern in our exploration of forgotten files takes us somewhere entirely different from a dark Texas road. We're going to a place designed specifically to eliminate surprise, to measure and track every object in the sky with precision instruments operated by trained personnel. We're going to the White Sands Missile Range in southern New Mexico in 1953. This was already, by the early 50s, one of the most closely monitored stretches of airspace in the United States. A vast desert expanse carved into grids and corridors where rockets were launched, telemetry was recorded, and experimental aircraft were tested under conditions meant to eliminate mystery rather than invite it. Every test launch was scheduled, logged, and communicated across multiple departments to avoid exactly the kind of confusion that was about to unfold. On this particular day, multiple observers stationed within or adjacent to the range reported the appearance of an unidentified aerial object maneuvering in restricted airspace, an object whose motion, altitude, behavior, and visual characteristics did not correspond to any scheduled test, experimental vehicle, or known aircraft operating in the region at the time. The witnesses weren't casual observers. They were range personnel accustomed to tracking missile launches, aircraft trajectories, and radar returns. Individuals trained to distinguish between test vehicles, conventional aircraft, atmospheric anomalies, and instrumentation errors. People who understood that unexplained reports carried professional risk rather than reward. According to the preserved civilian file, the object was described as metallic in appearance, lacking visible wings or control surfaces, and exhibiting a smooth, reflective surface that appeared to change brightness depending on its angle relative to the sun.
This detail was repeated independently by more than one observer and later noted carefully in follow-up correspondence. The object's motion was neither ballistic nor aerodynamic in any conventional sense. It didn't follow a predictable arc, nor did it behave like a guided missile. Instead, it maintained controlled horizontal movement before accelerating sharply and exiting the observed area without producing sound, exhaust, or a visible vapor trail.
What complicated the report further was that the object appeared within airspace that, under normal circumstances, should have been completely accounted for. All test launches, aircraft flights, and experimental activities were scheduled, logged, and communicated. Initial internal checks confirmed that no authorized vehicle matched the object's description, altitude, or timing. Radar logs from the period, while incomplete due to limitations of mid-century tracking technology, indicated anomalous returns that could not be immediately correlated with known targets. The witnesses did what procedure required. They reported the incident through proper military and technical channels, expecting clarification, correlation, or follow-up. For a brief period, the case appeared to move forward as inquiries were made and summaries drafted, before abruptly slowing and then stopping altogether. Within official documentation, the incident was eventually labeled as unidentified but attributed to possible instrumentation error or misidentification, despite the absence of a specific alternate explanation. It was quietly filed without further investigation. For the witnesses involved, the lack of closure was noticeable. Several follow-up inquiries received no response. Requests for clarification were met with silence. The case, though never officially disproven, was effectively closed by administrative inertia rather than resolution. It was at this point that copies of the report began circulating outside official systems. Some were shared informally among researchers and engineers who remained uneasy with the dismissal. Others were sent directly to civilian investigators who had begun to establish independent archives for cases that didn't survive institutional review. NICAP's handling of the White Sands file differed markedly from the official approach. Rather than condensing the report into a single explanatory paragraph, NICAP preserved witness statements in full, maintaining original language, uncertainties, and descriptive nuance, including phrases that reflected hesitation and restraint rather than certainty or excitement. The organization mapped the reported flight path using available geographic references, cross-checked known test schedules, and documented the absence of any corresponding missile or aircraft activity, noting explicitly that the lack of correlation was itself a data point rather than a failure. Importantly, NICAP didn't attempt to solve the case. They didn't insert speculative explanations. They didn't frame the incident as evidence of advanced technology or extraterrestrial origin. They simply retained it as unresolved, recognizing that some cases resist explanation not because of poor reporting, but because existing explanatory frameworks are insufficient. What makes the White Sands case particularly instructive within the context of forgotten files is not the strangeness of the object itself, but the process by which the report was transformed from a live investigation into a closed administrative matter without passing through the stages normally associated with resolution. The witnesses were credible, the location was controlled, the timing was logged, and yet the case didn't survive institutional filtering intact. Instead, it was compressed, labeled, and set aside. This is how forgotten files accumulate, not through conspiracy or suppression, but through efficiency, prioritization, and institutional discomfort with ambiguity. The case didn't threaten national security, it didn't produce debris, it didn't escalate, so it was allowed to drift. Yet for those who observed the object, and for those who later read their words, the drift itself became part of the story, illustrating how systems designed to catalog the unknown often struggle most when confronted with events that refuse categorization. Now we come to perhaps the most technically sophisticated case in our exploration of forgotten files, an incident that demonstrates what happens when the most advanced technology of its era confronts something it cannot measure, cannot match, and cannot explain. This is the story of a B-47 Stratojet crew on April 17, 1957, and what happened when their routine training mission became anything but routine. The B-47 was one of the most advanced aircraft of its time, a strategic bomber equipped with sophisticated electronic countermeasures equipment and operated by highly trained crews whose job was to maintain precise situational awareness over extended distances. This particular crew departed from MacDill Air Force Base in Florida in the early morning hours on what was intended to be a standard long-range training mission. 6 men, pilots, navigators, and electronic warfare officers, each assigned specific tasks, each monitoring separate systems, each trained to record and report irregularities with professional restraint rather than interpretation. As the aircraft proceeded northeastward over the Gulf of Mexico and into the southern United States, one of the electronic countermeasures officers detected an unusual signal on the aircraft's monitoring equipment, a signal that didn't correspond to known radar installations, friendly tracking systems, or expected sources of electronic emission along the planned flight path. Initially, the signal was treated as an anomaly, something to be observed rather than reacted to. But as the flight continued, the signal persisted, maintaining relative proximity to the aircraft in a way that suggested movement rather than stationary origin. As the B-47 crossed into Mississippi airspace, the signal strengthened, prompting further attention from the crew, who began cross-checking instruments and comparing readings to rule out equipment malfunction. This step revealed consistency rather than error. At roughly the same time, visual observation confirmed the presence of a bright object in the sky, described as a glowing light that appeared to maneuver in relation to the aircraft, maintaining distance and bearing in a way that didn't match conventional aircraft behavior, nor that of celestial objects such as stars or planets, whose apparent motion is predictable and unaffected by changes in aircraft heading. What followed was a prolonged encounter that unfolded over multiple states and several hours, during which the unidentified object was tracked intermittently by onboard electronic systems, visually observed by crew members, and at various points detected by ground radar installations as the aircraft passed within range of military and civilian tracking facilities. The object's behavior was notable not for sudden dramatic maneuvers, but for its persistence, appearing, disappearing, and reappearing as the aircraft altered course, altitude, and speed, sometimes remaining ahead of the B-47, sometimes falling behind, and at other times repositioning itself in a manner that suggested controlled movement rather than random drift. At one point, the object appeared to respond directly to a change in aircraft heading, shifting position in a manner that maintained relative orientation. This detail would later be emphasized in both official summaries and civilian analyses as one of the most difficult aspects of the case to explain through conventional means. Throughout the encounter, the crew maintained standard reporting discipline, communicating observations, logging times, and noting changes without speculation, a procedural calm that stands in contrast to the extraordinary duration of the event itself, which extended across multiple radar sectors and geographic regions. As the aircraft passed near several known radar installations, including sites capable of tracking high-altitude targets, ground controllers reported intermittent radar returns that correlated loosely with the aircraft's position and the timing of onboard detections. Though these returns weren't consistently strong enough to establish a continuous track, they provided partial corroboration of what the crew was experiencing. Eventually, as the B-47 approached its destination, the signal diminished and disappeared, and the visual object was no longer observed, allowing the aircraft to complete its mission without further incident. Following standard protocol, the crew filed a report upon landing, submitting timelines, instrument readings, and observational notes, expecting that the unusual duration and multi-sensor nature of the encounter would prompt further analysis. For a time, it appeared that this would be the case. The incident was reviewed within Air Force intelligence channels and eventually entered the files of Project Blue Book, where it was acknowledged as one of the more complex radar visual cases on record. However, as with many such cases, the official handling focused on narrowing possible explanations rather than preserving full uncertainty. Over time, the incident was attributed tentatively to electronic interference, radar side lobes, or misidentified celestial phenomena. explanations that addressed individual components of the encounter without fully reconciling the totality of observations. The crew, for their part, didn't publicly challenge the conclusions, nor did they promote alternative interpretations, but they also didn't retract their original statements, maintaining consistency in follow-up interviews conducted years later by civilian investigators. It was through these civilian efforts that the case achieved a second life. Copies of the original reports, along with supplemental correspondence and analysis, found their way into the archives of NICAP, where the incident was preserved in its full complexity rather than reduced to a single explanatory note. NICAP's analysis emphasized the convergence of multiple data streams: onboard electronic detection, visual confirmation by trained observers, and partial ground radar correlation, noting that while none of these elements alone constituted definitive proof of an extraordinary craft, their combined presence elevated the case beyond the category of simple misidentification. The B-47 incident occupies a unique position among forgotten files because it exists at the intersection of technology and uncertainty, demonstrating that even in environments saturated with instrumentation and procedure, some events resist definitive explanation. It's a case defined not by spectacle, but by persistence, not by sudden shock, but by sustained observation, and not by revelation, but by restraint, qualities that make it particularly well-suited to the quiet archival approach adopted by civilian investigators. In the end, the significance of the B-47 Stratojet incident lies not in what it reveals about the object itself, but in what it reveals about the process of investigation, about how data is filtered, categorized, and sometimes diminished in the pursuit of resolution, and about the role of forgotten files in preserving the full texture of human observation when official narratives move on. This is why the case remains essential, not because it provides answers, but because it preserves questions with precision, demonstrating the enduring value of archives that hold their course quietly through decades of shifting attention, waiting for a time when patience rather than certainty becomes the primary instrument of understanding. And that brings us to the heart of what makes these forgotten files matter. They're not trying to prove anything. They're not advocating for any particular explanation of the UFO phenomenon. What they're doing is something far more valuable. They're preserving the integrity of human experience, confronting the genuinely unknown. They're maintaining a record that allows future generations to ask better questions, to notice patterns that earlier researchers might have missed, to apply new analytical tools to old data. They're insurance against the kind of institutional forgetting that erases not just individual cases, but entire categories of human experience that don't fit neatly into established frameworks. These forgotten files, quietly maintained by civilian organizations for decades, represent one of the most important legacies in the history of UFO research: the recognition that some truths are preserved not through answers, but through the patient documentation of questions that refuse to go away.